Everything I was doing was about being the best at this and progressing. And then all of a sudden, boom, you can't do this anymore.
Máirtín Óg McDonagh, Connemara native, business coach and author. Thank you so much for joining me on Garry Talks.
They were pointing the finger at me. You took too many chances, you borrowed too much money. Who am I now? I'm not Máirtín Óg, the footballer, the manager, the businessman. I'm not anybody. I used to walk down to the sea, and there was a couple of mornings where I stood on my tippy toes and I went just to let myself in.
What made you walk back away from the water those 3 times?
This was grief at it. Huge. Nobody had died, but I felt I died.
This is a GK Media podcast. Great to have you on the podcast, Máirtín. Fascinating story you have, and I've seen you doing talks in front of people and tears have been shed and people can relate and connect to your story, whether, they've had similar experiences or they certainly, I think, feel it, like they're walking in your shoes. Let's just bring it back to, I think, where we often define ourselves, and that is childhood, because you had a tough childhood in the sense of you lost a parent, your father, at a young age. Can you talk us through that moment when you found out that your father had passed away?
Well, that was a tough time, I suppose. I got a very early introduction to the harsh realities of life, you could say, in that I depict the scene in my book, Mind Over Mountains, where I talk about being at the graveyard, not knowing really as an 8-year-old what was going on. It was a fine summer's day in June 1969. A beautiful day, actually. I remember it being very warm. And I remember hearing the graveyard in Carrow, where I'm from, in Carrowrua in Connemara. The old graveyard is set on a beautiful site right beside the sea. Mm-hmm. So that particular morning, even though there was a big crowd in the graveyard, I could hear the waves kind of splashing off the rocks, just literally 100 yards away. And the tide kind of rippling along the beach and that. But there was a big hole dug, and as is normal for a grave. And I saw the men lowering in a coffin. And I realised that the men who were lowering the coffin down were actually my uncles. And they were wearing, obviously, black suits and black ties with white shirts. But 2 or 3 of them were crying. And as the coffin was lowered in, as happens in Connemara, it's filled in. So I could hear the sound of the clay hitting off the coffin, and the stones as well, of course, because it's not perfect topsoil in Connemara, as anybody would tell you. And the stones hitting the coffin as well. And then I heard this kind of really loud, kind of wailing sound, really deep, hurtful, mournful, crying. And I looked up, and it was my mother that was crying. And my uncles were crying. And then a lot of people around me were crying. And then I realised that actually it was my father that had been lowered into the grave. And I think that was my first realisation that, oh God, this is your dad, the big strong man in the family. At 8 was my memory of him. And he'd taken me in his arms and thrown me up in the air and catching me again. He was a very strong man, very athletic person. But the enormity of that then just really hit me to whatever degree does hit an 8-year-old, that I realised that it was my father in the grave. And my mother had one hand on my shoulder. And I felt that weight of loss coming from her nearly. It came through me in a way. So that was my first introduction, really. There was 4 of us standing around the grave, actually, that day. And the 5th one of us, my mother was pregnant. My father was buried in June. And my youngest brother, which had been the 5th of us, wasn't born until August. So she was heavily pregnant at the time as well, in 1969. So that was where kind of the realisation of life hit me like a ton of bricks.
And what happened to him?
He had a tumour on the brain, and they gave him 6 months to live, but he actually lived nearly 2 years. Yeah, I've had a lot of conversations with my mother about him since now and that, because I vaguely remember him. not very well, but she said that those 2 years were really difficult in that he was sick a lot of the time and then he went to Dublin for surgery. And I remember that specifically because a lot of people came to visit the house, which I thought was strange. And he wasn't well before going to Dublin for the operation, and some people had to go up we had a 2-story house in the middle of the village in Carrow, and some people had to go up the stairs, and I could see some elderly people, they were struggling to go up the stairs, but they made a point of going up to see him in his bed. I was running in and out of the room, of course. So afterwards I was thinking about that again, that there was a sign there that people really wanted to see this man before obviously they knew he wouldn't be back. But yeah, it was tumour on the brain at the time. My mother remarried then again, actually, years later, to continue that story, I suppose. And would you believe it, she's buried her second husband. He struggled with Alzheimer's, but he had a very progressive Alzheimer's, and he only lasted a couple of years. He was a few years younger than her. And my mother then had 2 daughters with him, but like they're my sisters as far as I'm concerned. I'd probably be closer to one of them than any of the rest of the family. So there was ended up being 7 of us actually. But my mother she's still hale and hearty. She'll probably be listening to this, giving out to me afterwards.
I better not ask what age she is then, or she'll fop me.
No, sure. Look at my grey hairs. You can add a few years to that, then Garry, you might figure it out. Yeah.
And I presume then that she's a Gaeilgeoir 24/7, is she?
She is, yeah. Well, my mother would be Therese or Tess. Everyone calls her Tess. Tess O'Shea was her maiden name. And anyone who knows on Carrow or Carrow Road, there's a pub in the middle of the village called Unkishton. O'Shea's pub. So she's one of the O'Shea's. Okay. And like we have Kerry blood in us. Like it's my grandfather, my mother's dad, would have come to Connemara as a guard, and he eventually retired in that. But he married a local woman. And the pub, I believe, had been closed at the time. I don't know who, but he bought it. And it has been in the O'Shea's family since then. So my mother was one of the O'Shea's. And she married my father then initially. And my father's family would have been a very industrious family, really, in that they had trucks and machinery.
Oh, interesting.
Back in the late 40s, 50s. Into the 60s and 70s, and then I suppose I continued it on, ironically, with the way things went for me. And then one of my uncles, Pádraig, which was the eldest of my father's family, he went into fishing, and particularly trawlers and that, and he would have had some of the biggest trawlers on the west coast of Ireland during that time. So they were really industrious. Yeah. They went to England, of course, like everybody at the time, to earn some money to come back. But even in the UK, they were involved in any job. There was trucks involved in the machinery. They were involved in that. One of my uncles then, himself and his wife, ran the Corrib Princess on the Corrib, River Corrib for many years. Tom. So their son. I obviously got into the trucks and machinery as well, and I was very successful at that for many, many years. And
yeah, I want to get into you building the business around trucks and transportation and all that, and all the big projects you were involved in around Ireland. Mm-hmm. But before that, before you became a businessman, who was Máirtín Óg growing up in Connemara?
Right. I asked you before we started, Garry, deep, thought-provoking questions, but that's fairly deep now. I actually had a good childhood. Even though my father had passed away, and I think I probably get this from my mother. She's a very matter-of-fact kind of person, and whatever you have to do, well, make shapes and go and do it, and whatever you need to do to complete it, get it done. So, like, she had no choice but to get on with life during that time, and she ran a shop, which was old school type of shop where there was a grocery and she had a drapery. She sold some clothing and old women's knickers and all that kind of stuff. And she said to me a couple of times, she said, the women used to love you in the shop, she said, but I never made much profit from you. Whereas one of my brothers, Gabriel, was an accountant, and she said he was very strict, she said, and more matter of fact, and he did it the way it should have been done. And I said, what was wrong with the way I was doing it? Well, she said, I remember the time, she said, where you'd have to go in and there was a block of ice cream and somebody'd ask you for a bit of ice cream. with 2 wafers. I'm real old school here. But I used to give too many big portions. And the ice cream would be gone into 3 portions, whereas my brother Gabriel would get 6 or 7 out of it. That's one example. So she ran that shop, and then she ran a very busy B&B as well. We were right beside the Garda station in Carrow.
Okay.
And back in the days when B&Bs were, I suppose, in high demand,
Yeah.
she ran that. So our house at home, I remember it, and I reference it in the book. It was like a mini industry. There was consistently and constantly people coming, people into the shop, whatever else. And I remember, like, sometimes when she was short on help, she'd be inside in the kitchen and she'd be cooking and preparing meals and whatever for the guests, because she did full board at the time as well, which was breakfast, lunch and dinner. And then she had the shop, but she put a bell over the shop so that when you pushed in the door, you'd hear the bell going. And the crack was in our house like that. You'd hear the bell and she'd shout, "Somebody do the shop."
Yeah.
And or she'd say, "Then we'll be out in a minute," like the trustworthiness, I suppose, and of country life was lovely. But like, I remember I got a bike at a very early age because I needed to be independent. I couldn't be dependent on my mother. And when I started playing sports then, which I did very early in national school, I suppose, I had a talent for GA, for football in particular, and I was really good at it. And from that, then I went on to represent Galway at all ages at football, under 16, under 18, under 21 at the time, junior and on to senior. So my youth we were close to the school. I used to cycle up and down to it. A lot of the teachers said to me that I had a huge amount of ability, but I had no interest whatsoever. And I wouldn't quite put it that far, but I didn't have a huge interest, all right. I was more into sports and having a bit of crack and fun. But I had a good childhood.
So if you had no interest in what you were doing in school at the time, where did you see your future going? Like, were you thinking, "Oh, it's grand, I'll take over Mom's shop," or?
No, 100%. I had decided, Gary, no one's ever asked me that question before, by the way. 100% I had decided, coming up to my leaving cert, that I was going to join the Guards. And I think there was a couple of reasons for that. Maybe like county footballer, kind of being a guard. I liked the lifestyle. I liked the fact that you would have a fair bit of freedom dealing with people, whatever. So I was very sold on that. And I think when asked about it by career development teachers or whatever, I always said that I wanted to be a guard. College wasn't for me, I think.
Yeah.
And my English teacher tried to convince me differently. Lord have mercy on her. If she saw me now writing books, I say because she used to be always on my case. And I mean in a good way.
Yeah.
I think she saw my talents and abilities where I didn't see them.
Yeah.
And it's ironic. But yeah, being a Garda Síochána, that was up there as one of the things I thought I might fit into and would suit me.
And playing senior level with the Galway footballers, like, that must have been an amazing experience.
Well, it was, like, we're talking the 80s. Like, I suppose my claim to fame during that time was I was on the Galway under-21 team, as it was that time, for 3 years. And we got to an All-Ireland final and drew with Cork, and they bet us in a replay. So, like, we were still a junior club at home, which meant I could play junior football at county level. So I played at the Galway junior team in 1982 and 83, and then I was called onto the senior panel in 84. So I was obviously probably, they noticed me anyway. But it was short-lived, really, because I had a career-ending injury. I ruptured my ACL. And I tore a cartilage as well at the same time. So it was devastating that time, because...
That's a knee injury, is it?
It's a knee injury, yeah. Yeah, it's very common now for people. But that time in the early 80s, it was career-ending, really. I only knew of 2 people that had it done in this country and got their knees repaired, was Pat Spillane and Connemara, the Meath footballer and the Kerry footballer, respectively. So, like, I remember when I was diagnosed, and the surgeon in the Blackrock Clinic in Dublin, he just said to me, he said, "What's your story, Mr. McDonagh?" And I looked up at him. He was a Kerry man, Brian Herson. But I looked up at him and I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Can you afford," he said, "to be 5 months out of work to rehab your knee?" He said, "I need to rebuild it. It's in shreds." And I just said, "God, no." I said, I was after getting married the year before and I'd started the business. And I was busy with that, so there was no way I could afford to be 5 months. So long story short, and many, many years later, I never repaired that knee. And it was
even
fun.
to this day.
No, even to this day, when you consider, and we'll probably get to it later on.
All that you've
the
done.
stuff I've done, yeah. But that particular day when I left the Blackrock Clinic in Dublin, like when he said that to me, he was hovering over me. He was a really big man, but I was looking up at him, and it was like he hit me with a sledgehammer on the top of the head or on the forehead, because my life centred around sport and particularly GA at that time, and I could see myself improving and getting there, and everything revolved around it, like my training, my preparation, everything I was doing was about being the best at this and progressing. And then all of a sudden, boom, you can't do this anymore, definitely not at this level, county level.
Yeah.
He said to me, he said, I don't think you'll even get away, he said, doing it at club level. I think, he said, your knee will be too unstable. Now, for a couple of years after that, I tried playing with the club at home, but I kept breaking down. And then I was developing other problems with back problems and stuff. So eventually I gave it up completely, but it brought me into management at the club level at home, because I had experienced a lot working under good management teams and coaches for the couple of years I spent with Galway. So I said automatically, like I said, God, I have an awful lot to offer back here. So I did, and I had a lot of success early on with the club at home, and we won the junior county title, we won the intermediate county title 2 years later, and we got up to senior, first time ever for the club. So I was very involved in all that, and I took great pride from it, that the sport I loved, I was able to partake in it in some way.
So you must have felt like, with all respect, like a king in your village. You know, here you are, like, for those who aren't familiar, certainly in Gaelic areas, but in a lot of towns around Ireland, GA is a core part of the community, and to be playing, to get to senior level and then to be coming back and building the club up to All Ireland titles, it really brings everyone together. And, a lot of that is down to yourself. And at the same time, you have businesses where you're employing people from the town.
Yeah, well, my mother often tells me, she references that you were a big fish in a small pond. Like, that grounds me when she says that to me, and she always has. But yeah, whether I like it or not, I'd have to agree with you that, the success, and it gave me a lot of comfort and satisfaction that my involvement with some of this and the progress it was making from the sport, and how the locals and how the local club and the whole thing was being lifted by it. Never mind how my success was going with my work and that. But I suppose it all substituted for the loss that I had suffered myself by not being able to play at that higher level. And like, for someone listening to this now who might have somebody that they know who has had surgery and repaired their injuries of the same one that I've had, during that time it was not as commonplace. And as it is, one of my sister's daughters, she's in the Connacht rugby team, under 18, she's had her ACL redone, and she's only beginning to come back now. So like, it is very common now, but for me that time it was devastating. But the fact that I went away and I started playing first, and then I kept breaking down, I said, God, what could I do here to stay involved and, pass on the knowledge that I've learned? And then, ironically, I suppose, that led me to find out as well that actually I was someone who could have a very positive influence on people. Because like every club in Ireland, we had 2 or 3 or 4 guys, some of them might be listening to this now, that were troublesome.
Yeah.
Where they had huge ability, but it was very hard to keep them on track in a small rural club in the west of Ireland. But I found I had a way with them.
Keep them on track in terms of they liked going drinking and...
Yes, and stay focused on training and stay focused on the doing good and, the bigger picture of down the line, what we could achieve in that. So I found that I could sit down with them at their level and say, God, Garry, we really need you here. Your abilities in that position, we don't have 3 or 4 people. will you guarantee that you'll work with me and we'll work together for success? And I found that many of them have come up to me since and they said they really enjoyed the time and it brought them on a lot. And the fact that somebody, I suppose, was sharing something with them and supporting them and in some way challenging them, but coaxing them along to become better themselves. And yeah, it was, and when I look at what I'm doing now in particular as a coach, but during that time as well in the late 80s, I suppose I was doing the same thing, but in a different way. Yeah. So I never looked at it like, my mother's comment about a big fish in a small pond. Well, I was that person. A lot of stuff was revolving around me, but I felt I was well able for it. And I think in scenarios in life, if you are good at certain things and it means that you have to lead or help people and get people together for some big challenge or goal or something, and if you have that gift, why not do it?
So business, you enter the world of business like your mother and your father.
Yeah, I did very early, actually. Yeah, very early.
In your 20s, is it? Early?
Yeah, in my 20s. Yeah, and I got married in my 20s as well, actually, the first time, and it felt like a natural progression for me. That even though my father had passed away many years before that, 1969, as I said earlier, I went into business in the end of 82, 83. So there's that big gap where it was just, shouldn't say just, it was my mother running two businesses out of the house.
And this was a recession though, wasn't it, in Ireland?
It was, yeah. But I could see potential because I could see all around me that there was construction. People were looking for whatever it was, for building materials, for construction materials, and there was a lack of supply in our immediate circle of probably 30 or 40 miles. So I said to myself that definitely there's a niche there. Údarás na Gaelic that they were developing at the time, trying to encourage employment, and they were building industrial estates. I said that there probably might be opportunities there. Some of the quarries in Galway were screaming out for trucks to haul their materials and that. So I identified probably a niche, and it was natural. And very quickly I bought a truck first, and then I bought another one, and then I bought a machine, and then I bought another one. And all of a sudden, within a short space of time, I was turning over an awful lot of money. And I was enjoying it, actually, and I was good at it. And I became very successful at that for many years.
How many people did you have working for you?
Well, I created a lot of employment, but from early beginnings, and some of the guys that started off with me, one or two of them went on to run their own businesses, and they come down to visit me now in Connemara, and we have a couple of pints and we look back on life, and they ask me, do I miss it? And I say, no. All of that. But it is, we'll talk later, I suppose, about when things went wrong and that adversity and what that brought. But I think I struggled so much with the outfall of what I had gone through that part of my life, I kind of left it back there. And I think some of it is because what I was carrying for a long time, Garry, I was carrying this hurt of self-blame and having been so successful early on and making really good decisions and creating this juggernaut, if you like, of being an employer, being very involved in sport, playing life at the high end of life, and being really successful at that for such a long time. And then I suppose I was taking steps up all the time. And then there came a time where I wouldn't say I fell back down, but something opened under my feet and I just fell through it.
Yeah.
And I ended up much further down than I'd ever been in my life.
I can see why that, reading your body language, you don't want to boast or even shine a spotlight on that period of real, success in your life because of the aftermath of what happened. But I think it's important as well to acknowledge that you were very successful. You had a load of people employed. You were a millionaire in your 20s. You know, you'd great turnovers. You were working on big projects. Like it, you know, that did take hard work. You know, it's important to acknowledge what you did achieve.
I agree with you. And like when, I suppose, at the depths of the heights, or whatever way you want to look at it, glass half full or glass half empty, when I was at a place where I was not in a good place, I was coached by a guy in America, and I reference it in my book. It's common knowledge, Scott Ballard. And like every so often we have a call every couple of months where I coach him and he'd coach me. But at the time, it was my initial introduction to the man. And he just said to me, he said, do you know, he said, in mountaineering terms, he said, Máirtín, he said, you're stuck, he said, at base camp. And he said, you're carrying this big, huge weight, he said. And he said, you have such ability, he said, to go to the top. And I was looking at him. It was a Zoom call, obviously. He was in the States. I was in Connemara. And he said, you know, he said, you look at the losses and what went wrong. And he said, you look at your marriage breaking up, he said, and you're carrying all that weight of responsibility and feel like it was your fault. But he said, what about all the successes you had? And he said, relationships break down, and it's never one person's 100% fault. And he said, going back to that time, he looked at, and he moved his face forward. I could see him in the Zoom. And he said, it was a global financial crisis. He said, repeat that after me. So simple when I think back about it. I repeated after him, it was a global financial crisis. It was not Máirtín Óg's crisis, he said. I had to repeat that after him again. And just, he said, you need to lift yourself out of where you are, he said, and think about all the successes you've had. So it was amazing, like the fact that you've said it there now, it just reminded me of that conversation I had with him. But like it's.
But can we talk about the success? Talk about the project you're working on and how many was on the books? Is it 70 people or so?
I didn't answer that question earlier. Sorry.
No, you didn't. Sorry.
I did. Sorry. I had about, between 60 and 70. And then with the development of the other business, which was the construction predominantly, I had probably 25 employees there, but I had an awful lot of subcontractors involved as well.
Okay.
But initially the plant business, which I had for over plant and machinery business, that was the really solid core business, which I had for, I think, 34 years.
Wow.
And like, as I said, I became really good at it and really proficient, but I had really good lads working for me as well. Really very good crew, and they were very loyal to me. And they did work as if they were doing it for themselves. You know, if you got a couple of my guys doing a one-off site for you, or building 100 houses, or building a big road project, they took it on as if it was their own.
Yeah, great
They
pride.
were really conscious and very proud of it. And I kept good machinery under them. I kept good trucks, and they appreciated that. I paid them as well as I could and looked after them, because I felt they were an extension of me. And without them, I couldn't operate where I was operating, and I suppose the same for them with me. And some of them who are still really friendly with me, and they contact me very often, they do appreciate that time. But going back to what you mentioned about contracts, I was really lucky like that. I managed to, I think I was probably a good negotiator. I was convincing, if I got into a room, that if I was being considered for a contract, I usually ended up getting it. Thinking back about it now, I didn't look at it as such a gift at the time. I looked at it as kind of, this is bread and butter stuff. We need to get this job.
But it's probably because you're so personable from learning how to communicate with people in the shop, in your mother's shop years ago.
I think that was a huge thing. Like, and I had a way of, didn't matter who was sitting in front of me, of convincing them that I could do something. So I remember the first big break I got, like, and I mentioned that in the book as well, is from O'Malley's, one of the biggest and I suppose most prolific builders in Galway, and still building away. One of their directors at the time, Michael Mooney, I met him, and they were starting the famous Air Square Centre in 1989. And I remember going into the boardroom in Augustine Street there in O'Malley's head office, and he said, Máirtín, he said, convince me that you can do this contract. Because I had rung him. There was rumours that it was going elsewhere to some of the bigger contractors in a neighbouring county that I'd rather not mention. And we only played them in kind of finals and things. But it was rumoured they were getting it. So I made an approach. I had started doing a little bit of work for O'Malley's previously, through a guy who I didn't know, but he put a bit of faith in me because he saw me bringing in and out materials for some of the quarries in Galway. So he asked me, would I be interested in doing a small bit of work? He said, you'd be dependable, I'd say. So that was the first bit. So then I approached them about this big contract, and Michael Mooney said to me, he said, Máirtín, he said, convince me that you can do this. Because he said, this is a big bite for you to take from this start if we let you at it. Well, I convinced him anyway, and he called me back a couple of days later. He said, we're going to give you the contract, he said. But he said, you won't let us down. I said, no way. So that was a huge break for me at the time. It was one of the biggest jobs, definitely in the West Coast, if not the whole of Ireland that time.
When you get a phone call like that, are you excited? And then seconds later, you start panicking, saying, oh my God, can I actually pull this off?
No, I'm a good man in a crisis. I don't panic. No, and I don't know where that came from, but like even to this day, I'd be a good man to have in the Titanic. Like,
okay,
we might be going to end up sinking anyway, but I put up I put up a big fight before we'd sink.
Yeah.
You know, I'd save a lot of people before the ship would sink, and that was huge for me. But then, like, that turned out well, and we went onto a lot of other contracts, like the likes of Jury's Hotel, the Keys Bar, where they were doing the basement there. That was a really difficult one because it was green granite, and green granite is impossible to break. And we had to blast it out of it when you consider where it was and that. So, like, there was a lot of Galway Bay Hotel. We did a lot of work there, and an awful lot of housing estates around Galway at the time. I was working on the Athlone bypass, the Ormore bypass, with an awful lot of other jobs. But there was huge, big contracts. Like, one of the most difficult ones I had in latter years was the deepening of the harbour in Rossaville, where a company called Dredging International got the contract, and they wanted local machinery if possible, and big dump trucks. Now, I had a selection, but I didn't have near enough. But once I knew I had an opportunity getting in there, I decided. And like, I was lucky that a lot of the plant suppliers, and particularly, I suppose, the finance houses, they worked with me. And like, we took on that. It was 7 days a week, 24 hours, and it was high octane stuff because we were excavating out of water, out of seawater. And that creates huge complications. It's really hard on the gear. The tips of the teeth and the buckets were wearing every couple of weeks. It was very hard on the bodies of the dump trucks because of the salt water.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of things to take into consideration. Then I was working with crews. I had to take on people that I wasn't too familiar with. And that was one of the biggest challenges, I think, as an employer, actually. As where I had my initial crew who were very loyal to me, even when it grew to 20, 25, definitely 70, 80% of them had kind of grown with me, and I could trust them. And that was a big thing for me, Garry. If you were employing me, I didn't want, if we were supposed to be starting a job at 7 a.m., I didn't want any of my crew coming at 7:20 and making a habit of it.
Yeah.
None of them did. And I didn't want them taking any shortcuts or anything, because I wanted whatever we were doing to pass any inspection, so that there wasn't a problem to get paid, and that we were being looked at as better than everyone else because of what we do. But as it grew, it became more difficult to have that, I suppose, honesty, and to have that control, if you like. But I think it was kind of a spirit, a community, a way of doing things that we had. And as the numbers of employees grew, it was harder to keep on top of that.
Yeah,
I struggled a bit with that. And then, like, as a business coach now, one of the big things I see people struggling with, I struggled with it myself. I tried to be good at everything. And sure, none of us are good at everything. And like, when the pressure came on with the financial crisis and that, the areas where I was not strong are the first, I mentioned Titanic earlier, they're the first parts of my businesses that started to let in water. And all of a sudden, I couldn't put sticking plasters on them. They became huge holes. And then my boat began to list, if you like. So, like, one of the things that I work hugely in conjunction with business leaders now, if I'm working with them, is what are the areas that you're not comfortable in? What have you done about that? How can you make improvements there? Because everybody, of course, we all want to talk about stuff we're good at.
Yeah, and we want to ignore what we're not good at.
Well, ignore is probably, maybe for some people. But I would say that it's another way of looking at what you said, Garry, actually. Those areas that I wasn't strong in, I wasn't ignoring them, but I wasn't doing anything about them.
Okay, yeah.
I was kind of giving it lip service. Oh, jeez, I'll have to get to it. I'll get to it. I was really good at getting the work. I was really good at getting it done, keeping everything going. But the paperwork and some of the other certifications and some of the, it'll be fine. It'll be all right. Totally dependent on the people who were paying me quickly.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, the list of people who weren't getting invoiced, stuff backing up, it was just, and I was full throttle, getting the work done, keeping it done, keeping on top of things, keeping on top of employees. I was spreading myself too thin. And like when in the initial business, the plant and machinery, when that grew substantially, it became more difficult to keep doing what I wanted to keep doing. But my mistake, if you want to call it, was as I still tried to do all of that on my own. When I look back at what I was doing now at the time, and like, you know, if you said to me, will you go into the room there and the door wasn't open, I'd go through the wall. So that was my mentality that time. I need to get in there.
Yeah.
Whereas the sensible thing would have been to turn around the corner and open the door and walk in and say, all right, what should I learn there? There's other ways of doing things. Yeah. But it had been successful for me, but it had grown so much that there were so many walls I needed to go through that it was wearing me down.
And at this stage as well, the Celtic Tiger is taking place in Ireland. So the economy is absolutely booming. And I've spoken about it before on the podcast. But just to reiterate, it was like a waterfall of cash out of ATMs at the time. No one had a sense that it was going to end.
No, and well, like for me, some people who know me very well, like a lot of them, or most of them, I think, everyone who has spoken to me openly about it anyway, when I say everyone, I suppose 5 people that were really close to me, would have since said to me, God, I never realised that you were in so much trouble at the time of the global crisis, and all of a sudden you started to lose your businesses. And while it took time for me, who was in the middle of it, it was like an eternity, but it probably took 2 years, 2.5 years maybe, till it got to its worst. But that 2.5 years were the worst 2.5 years of my life. And I wouldn't wish them on my worst enemy. I don't have any enemies, but if I did, I wouldn't wish them on my worst enemy, because the stress of trying to keep both businesses afloat was unbelievable. Like
what started to happen was people just stopped. They couldn't pay bills, or
well, that's only a small part of it, Garry. And I suppose I need to be conscious that people listening to this mightn't have a clue where I'm coming from. But like when I set up a second business in 2005. Well, now, don't forget, let's go back slightly here. My plant business was really solid. I had a lot of equity in it, a lot of good machinery paid for. I had some stuff on finance, but not that much. So I had an awful lot of stuff going to work every day with no finance to pay.
And your turnover is in?
My turnover was in the millions now at this stage. But when I set up the second business in 2005, early 2006, I called it Óg Developments. And I went into developing. Initially, we had a lot of success, early, small jobs and that. But then I could see opportunities for bigger developments. So the biggest one, of course, was the one I did at home, which was an 8.6 million development. But
in Carrow?
Yeah, and I was about 70% through it. I worked with local builders here at Purcell Construction, and they went out. I went through a tender process. 3 of the bigger builders tendered for it. I decided to work with Purcell's. And I was about 70% through that, and I was going in. In other words, a lot of the houses had been probably 60% complete. There was 2 sites. We were working on another building, then a standalone commercial building on the other side, and that was probably 40% complete. And I was going into a meeting with the builders, architects, engineers at the time. It was kind of nearly a daily occurrence, but they were bringing everyone together for this meeting. And while I had got some funding from AIB and they'd committed to cover the whole project, I was going up the stairs to a boardroom meeting with 11 people in front of me, and I got a phone call. The phone rang in my pocket, and I answered the phone. It was my bank manager at the time, and he said to me, Máirtín, he said, AIB, he said, the bank, he said, are not going to fund the project to its completion. And I said, what? Well, I used colourful language. And he said, well, they've decided, he said, they don't want to be out that much in Carrow. And I said, like, I've sold most of the properties, I said. And what isn't sold, I've agreed leases on with strong tenants and everything. I know, he said, they've made a decision here. He said, we've been stretched all over the place, he said, and they don't want. So there was some other small talk and dirty talk and colourful talk. So,
how are they even allowed to do that, though, if they committed to
Well, at the time, a lot of things were done, and like anyone who tell you the truth, like in my case, I had 2 businesses. One of them was really strong, but then money was being taken from one to try and support the other, and the next thing it put the solid business in trouble as well. But I'll never forget, one of the hardest things I had to do that time was go into that boardroom meeting and say, guys, this project, to finalise it, I'm in a bit of trouble here. While whatever has been done will be honoured and paid, whatever has to be completed, there's no funds for it. So all hell broke loose. They took grave offence, as I probably would have done myself if it was in those circumstances. And the project ground to a halt, everything was stopped. So that created a huge complication then, Garry, on the other side. If you were somebody who had bought a house off Máirtín Óg or bought a commercial property, all of a sudden the site was closed down. So everybody was saying, what the F-U-C?
Yeah.
And I was caught in the middle of all that, trying to see, could I secure funding some other place? We were in the middle of the global financial crisis, and trying to keep my plant and machinery business going. That was owed a lot of money from my development company as well. Plus, as you said earlier, there was a lot of smaller builders, a lot of other projects that couldn't afford to pay me. They were in the same situation as myself. But the bigger one, the development company, that was in the shit. Now, there was other reasons as well. I had other land and other developments that were in the planning process, where I had bought land at the height. All of a sudden, it didn't have planning permission. So the loans against some of that was up there, but the values of it were down there. So there was this space in the middle where, what's going to happen here? So all of a sudden, everything was, but not alone was everything like that. I was like that. So all of that weight, every decision, every phone call, every solicitor's letter, everything that everybody wanted a chunk of me for, I was trying to be sitting down talking to people. 30, 40, 50 phone calls a day. My phone used to run out of charge at lunchtime. My marriage was in trouble. The pressure became so enormous that we split up during the whole thing. And I needed to run for cover. And the biggest predominant thought for a while was, I'm not able for this. And I moved out of my family home, obviously, and I moved over to Inverness. And I reference it in the book, it's no secret. I moved in with one of my sisters, Fionnuala. She's a nurse, caring person. And her husband, Máirtín, and their 3 kids. They had a garage, which they were converting, but it was speedily converted to get me into it anyway. And I spent 4.5 years there, actually. But I moved in there, and some of the hardest nights of my life I had in that place. I wasn't sleeping. The pressure I felt on my chest was just unrelenting. I couldn't lift it. There were so many things I was trying to sort out. And I felt helpless. For the first time in my life, I felt like, Jesus, what have you done, man? And not sleeping at night in the darkness, and sometimes hearing the rain or hearing the wind. I used to get up in the middle of the night and I wasn't sleeping, and I used to walk down to the sea. And anybody who knows, Invern Tihulan is the pub out there just past Spiddle. My sister lives up to the right up there. So I used to walk down to the sea in the mornings and just sit there and cry. And it was serving no purpose, but I just felt that for me it was a release. But then the more I was doing it, the heavier I was every morning. And there was a couple of mornings where I stood on my tippy toes and I went just to let myself in. I did that in 3 particular days when I was walking down the road. I didn't think I'd be walking back up. And that gives me the shivers now thinking about it. But that's how bad I felt, and that's how personally I took it. Because I looked at this as, like, don't forget everybody was blaming me.
Yeah.
Including my family. They were pointing the finger at me. You took too many chances, you borrowed too much money. I could go on for the rest of the podcast about stuff that was being said to me. And some of it was true, of course. Hands up. So that burden of responsibility and blame and heaviness of having made some decisions, bad decisions, call them whatever you want. Then, like the thoughts of, losing my father, getting injured, blah, 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 as you do when you slip into those places. All of a sudden, everything I could think of was making me feel worse.
Yeah.
And making me feel useless, making me feel small, making me think thoughts like, who did you think you were? What are you trying to do? Oh, there you are now. You deserve it. All of that multiplying, no positive stuff. Where was, my life was a jigsaw. There was pieces all over the floor. Pick out a positive piece there, Gary. And you'd look at me and say, oh, Máirtín, I don't think there is any, which is what I thought.
Mm.
And there was no television in my sister's place at the time either. And I'd stopped exercising. I wasn't able. I was just barely functioning. I lost a lot of weight. I stopped drinking, actually. And I was
going to say, did you turn to drink or anything?
No, I was a social drinker, but people would say, who know me, a good social drinker. But I like a few pints, but I decided that was definitely a road to nowhere. So I didn't go down that road. So eventually, one of my sisters rang me one night, Angela, and there's someone in everybody's family that everyone is afraid of, even though I was the eldest. Angela said something, you kind of paid attention. But she rang me one Sunday night, I'll never forget it, and she said to me, I answered, I saw her name coming up on the phone, and she said, I heard you're in trouble. I said, I am, and I went off for about 10 minutes spiel of where I was and whatever was going on those few weeks and everything. And she said to me, well, she said, you haven't effing killed anyone. And she said, she did ask me, she said, are you drinking? I said, no, I haven't had a drink. I said, and I don't know how long it was at that stage, 4 months or something. And she said, I'm going to give you the name of someone, she said, I want you to go to, and this person will help you.
So like the crash was around 2008, so this probably...
Yeah, I think it was maybe 2011
or so.
No, it was 2010, I think, yeah. It was, yeah. Thanks, you got me back on track there. I didn't know, like she said to me, she gave me a number and I said, I'm not going to any quack, I said to her. I don't know what words I use, quack or counsellor or therapist. And I kind of cursed at her. Like I said, would I be doing that? Well, she said, if you don't go, she said, I'm going to bring you. It's Sunday night, I'm going to Galway on Tuesday. She's living up in Mayo now. So reluctantly, I rang that lady, who happened to turn out to be a lady, and she was a coach, life coach. And I went to her, and that was the start of making some slight adjustments, but big improvements to my life. And I didn't realise it till afterwards. I met her a couple of years afterwards, the same lady, and in a filling station in Dublin, on my way to Dublin, one of the Apple Greens, and she was going in the door and I was coming out, and she looked sideways and I looked at her, and she stopped and she said, oh my God, Máirtín, she said, how are you? So I told her, and she said, God, she said, you were in a bad place. And as a coach now, I know that if I'm coaching somebody who I think I'm not able to help, if I think at all, 1%, if I think that they need a therapist or a counsellor, I need to tell them.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's their expertise, which I don't have. So I said to that woman that day, having qualified myself, doing what I'm doing now, I said, why didn't you refer me? And she smiled at me. And she said, Máirtín, from the first meeting, she said, I was really apprehensive, she said. I thought about it umpteen times, she said, but you came back, she said, early the following, we had arranged, and I said I'd make a decision based on our second session. But she said, as we were talking, she said, I saw, she said, something in you, she said, some flicker of something, she said, that I said, no, this guy's going to pull himself out of this. And she said, every time you were coming to me, she said, it was getting stronger and stronger. No, she said, I could barely feel it in the beginning, she said, but it was there. And she said, do you know, she said, you were coming to me twice a week for 13 weeks. I didn't know that. But she said, every time you were getting stronger and stronger and stronger. So that was where it started for me. And I went back to the jigsaw that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
And I started picking. And some of the pieces I picked out were, who was I as a person? What values did I have? And of this whole jigsaw on the floor, there was a mess. Of course, there was an awful lot of it totally outside of my control. And it's the same for anybody listening to this that might be dealing with some sort of difficulty, whatever it is, that the only thing sometimes that we have left, that we have any control over, are our thought process and the actions you can take around that.
Yeah.
I know it sounds really simple to someone stuck in it like me that time, but that's what I went back to. And those little pieces I picked out, my mental health, my physical health came later, but God, Máirtín, you can't keep doing this to yourself. You won't be able to keep this going. This is chronic stress.
Mm-hmm.
You need to pull yourself back from that. There's an awful lot of that stuff that you can have no influence whatsoever over. So pick out what you can. Your own choices, your own mindset, your own actions. Go for a walk. Enjoy nature. Make a cup of coffee. Pull yourself out of where you are, because you cannot fix so much of that. And that was where I started. I know to someone that's listening to this now that says it couldn't be that simple, but for me, that's definitely, and it was that jigsaw and just taking little pieces and allowing myself to feel good. Talking to that guy in America came months later, but when he said to me, well, you know, he said, you've been so successful for so long, he said, and coming from where you come from. So I began to get a bit of comfort out of that. And one or two friends, and in my presentations, and if I'm doing a talk or something, I talk about the value of having one or two friends that you're comfortable with. And I was lucky I had one or two. I had two in particular that contacted me religiously every week, and every couple of weeks met me for a coffee. And they weren't coaches or therapists or anything.
Because there's something that's really stuck with me that you said at one of your talks before, where like New Year's Eve, you were that guy who kind of stepped aside from the party and was texting like loads of people, wishing them a happy new year. And, you know, you could be sending up to 150 texts or whatever.
Yeah.
And when you hit rock bottom, that there really only was a couple of people.
That's all,
that, you know, would check in on you. Yeah.
And that, like, there was two people, and that meant so much to me that they were willing to sit down and talk about the state of the GA or talk about whatever, or how you doing? I'm not too bad. How are you coping? I'm doing all right. I went for a walk this morning. Oh, just good man. Are you on the bike? No, I'm not able for that yet. I will meet you next Thursday. Are you around? How's 10 o'clock? Even that meeting next Thursday. This person is willing. He's not blaming me. He's not pointing the finger at me. And I had a client recently, Garry, that was struggling with his past and was stuck in that place where I was stuck myself for a long, long time. And he was angry and he was blaming everybody, and it was poor me. And I was that person for a long time as well. But when you are operating in that place, and I referenced it as being in a cocoon. Now, a cocoon is comfortable. And I was in that cocoon, and this gentleman that I was coaching, I'm still coaching him actually, but when you're in that cocoon, there's comfort in it because you can blame everything outside and you go into it and you hide away from people. During that time, like if I saw you at a filling station, I wouldn't go in.
Yeah.
If I saw you coming out of a coffee shop, I wouldn't go into it because I was ashamed. I was embarrassed. I knew everybody, the big fish in the small pond all of a sudden landed back in a smaller pond.
Yeah.
And I felt like everybody. And add to that the complication of a marriage breakup. Oh, she threw him out. Oh, she did it. Whatever.
Yeah.
People say. So I was I was in this cocoon of self-pity.
Yeah. Like you'd people who you'd employed for over 35 years who,
yeah, of course,
suddenly had to let go.
And then
you owed millions as well, then, didn't you?
I did, yeah. I was owed a lot of money, but I owed millions. Yeah, of course, yeah. And it didn't balance.
So like you lost your businesses, you lost your marriage, you suddenly owed millions. Like
I lost my identity as well, Garry, which was a huge one. Like, if I said directly to someone listening to this podcast, say, think about this, look in the mirror, and you can't do what you've been doing for 40 years anymore. You're broke. Your marriage is broken. You've lost your confidence. How would you survive? Who would you be? What would you do about it? That's where I was. And it's very hard to describe how low, deflated, I don't know what are the words I could use, all of them and plenty more, that you're just so flummoxed, flattened, you feel useless. Who am I now? Like, I'm not Máirtín Óg, the footballer, the manager, the businessman. I'm not anybody. I'm not Máirtín Óg, the husband. I'm not Máirtín Óg, the father. So it was worse and worse, it seemed to be getting. So to look, and I'm referencing the jigsaw, to look at that pile of my life, how did I create this? And that was the way I was looking at it. Why did I do this? Was it all, as somebody said to me at a talk recently, all those fucking mistakes I made? And that's where I found myself, and that's where I've come from.
What made you walk back away from the water those 3 times?
Yeah, I went back there years later, and it was a strange feeling. It was a summer's morning that I was going back to visit my mother. I was living in Connemara at the time, and I'm 9 years down there now, 9.5 years. And I just said, I'm going to go down here. I need to do this. So I went down and I parked in the car park, and I walked over to where I used to walk, and I stood at the edge, and the tide wasn't fully in, but it was in about halfway in, but there was a good drop down, and I just looked over the edge, and the hair stood on the back of my head, and I could feel the little tears coming down each side of my eyes, and it brought me back to one in particular. One night I was down there, it was really raining, lashing heavy, as typical West of Ireland November morning at 4:30, very dark. I had no flashlights or anything. I just didn't want, if something happened to me, I didn't care. That's where I was. But in answer to your question, I think that particular day, having seen the light of day, something stopped me, and I was saying, God, Máirtín, doesn't matter how it's turned out. You're a father. You have 2 kids, grown up children. Your mother is still here. And look what she's gone through. You're a brother, you're a sister. You were an employer for many years. You're somebody who makes a difference in people's life. You need to start thinking differently. And that got me back a couple of times. I think that particular day was that was the hardest. But the worst thing, I think, for people to deal with, and for me in that particular instance, was like, this was grief at a huge, nobody had died, but I felt I died.
Yeah.
But I was still alive. suffering the consequences, which was a worse death. But for me to pull myself back from that, and you let out a sigh of relief and you go, "Jeez, wasn't he lucky he didn't do that?" But it doesn't stop there. And the other two occasions, the same small talk came into my head. But what I want to get across in this is that while you give yourself that space of, looking for some sort of, I talk about seeds of positivity now. It doesn't matter what you're struggling with. It doesn't matter what adversity there's always something. And I began to look at it like that, hold on a minute, you're still here, man. I was hearing about other people who were struggling the same, the biggest developers in the country, whatever else, some were not here anymore.
Yeah.
But that wasn't doing me any good either. But believing in myself again that, people will have to work with you. You're going to have to find a way out of this. You're going to have to. I began to start thinking constructively. They were my seeds of positivity. But don't forget, and this is what I want to get to, for my sister opened in a television for me then, that's very relevant. And I used to watch, sometimes I'd flick it on just to see, not the news. I couldn't watch the news because what was on it? Oh, sure, banks and this and that and that. But I used to watch an odd film. But then when I was watching the films, it was like somebody was sticking something into me again, because sad films would come on, or family films, with the father gone off with the daughter and the mother gone off something else. And then they come together and there's a big dinner. I didn't have that. And that was making me really emotional. And then a sad song on the radio or something that would remind you. I like country and western music, and sure, a lot of them are I shot the wife and I shot the dog and I shot the kids. So there was, like, even though I was beginning to lift myself with the coaching and with the positivity that I began to look for, and my mindset shifting a little bit, all of these things were bringing me back again. And it's, oh God, will this ever go? I'm struggling here. I really want to start looking at things differently. I want to start taking positives out of this thing, take another piece out of the jigsaw on the floor, something that I can have an influence on, something that I can change and improve. Yet these things that come at me, or I'd pass someone on the road and they wouldn't salute me. And I'd take it, they probably didn't even see me, but I'd take it, there's Garry, he didn't even put up his hand.
Yeah. Putting
myself into this place. Jesus, yeah. And then the solicitor's letter to the arrive. And then you'd be saying, God, what am I going to do here? So that was, and that happens, people who are trying to pull themselves out of situations where, like, life has a way of, it doesn't always go smoothly. We'd always win the lotto and you'd always be at the Galway races and everything would be lovely. But it does kick you in the you-know-where. And sometimes it never comes in ones, like it's usually twos and threes and whatever. And it could be every red light today as you're passing and, I have a puncture as well. And I have no change for something else and I'm late for this or that. But there's always, and I found, and that for people ask me now, they say, how long did that go on? Initially it was very consistently, like daily. Then it became weekly. But after a couple of months, sort of, I used to nearly get 2, 3 or 4 weeks before something had come at me. But like even to this day, Garry, there are certain things or certain events or certain places I was at an event, I was invited to it, and this gentleman came over talking to me. He's following me on LinkedIn. And he kind of punched me in the ribs, and I'm well able to take a punch in the ribs because I look after myself now. And like he jokingly said, God, he said, what a comeback. I didn't know him. And he said, I'm following your stuff on LinkedIn. He said, I love your newsletter every Thursday. And he said, God, he said, after what you've been through, he said, it's great to see you. He said, you come back now. He said, you're helping people. He said, and helping business owners. And Jesus, great. And like he was giving it this. And then he came back about a half an hour later and he was at it again. And I just said, look, I said, I appreciate, I said, what you're saying to me. And I appreciate, I said, that, you're delighted for me and where I find myself now. But I said, from that time, I said, in my life, I said, I have an ex-wife who probably will never talk to me again. I have a daughter who I have a very strained relationship with, and I have grandchildren I don't see. And I said, that's down to that time. Not in anything particular I did, I said, but it was down to the circumstances and the fallout of that time. And then he looked at me with his mouth open and he said, I'm so sorry. He said, I didn't realise that. So, like, managing that in the years where I suppose my progression has gathered legs a little bit. But like anybody who's been through trauma or grief, or there's a legacy, like, and there's parts of your life that are always going to be affected.
Yeah.
But you do get better at it. And I'd say that to anybody listening here who might be struggling with something and finding it hard to shake it. You do get better at it. Talking about it, definitely. I wouldn't be able to do this 3 years ago. I'd be on the floor there, sobbing. But you do get better at it, and you learn from it as well. And you know that there's certain parts of life that you will never feel 100% comfortable with. But you'll manage it, and manage it in such a way that you'll be able to progress. And that's was a big learning for me. Still dealing with that, those results and the consequences and the fallout, if you want to call it that. It's probably a better word. That while people assume that, oh, that fella's flying, going around in a pair of shorts and he in the gym 3 mornings a week and going off climbing mountains and whatever else.
There's still huge hurts there.
And Connemara on a Saturday night, whatever it is. But there is, and for other, I know for the other side as well, and people who were working for me, were associated with me, who lost their jobs, like, there is another side to everybody's story, you know. So, like, when I see quotes now about, you know, be kind, you don't know what's going on with the other person, I think it's very true. Yeah. And, you know, try to understand that maybe somebody who's struggling in some way that you might know anything about, that it's important, especially nowadays. I think people are carrying so much stress and struggling with life. Sometimes a smile, or, you know, meeting someone for a coffee. And that's what I say. I say it a lot to clients, but I definitely say it in my talks and presentations. Like, in a relationship, whether it's your other half or your wife or whatever, listen to the other person. But don't just ask a question. Listen to the answer. And I'd say to some people in employment sometimes, how do you show up for other people? Because unfortunately, we've gone down the space now of, it's all about me. What can I get out of you? And you need to give me more for what I'm doing for you. But it needs that. We need to change that. And we need to become more of a team supporting each other. And especially when things are not going right for one or two members, because it could be you next week. Yeah. Because I tried to carry what I was going through. I tried to carry it myself inwardly, and nearly killed me. And if there's any message of the 1,164 messages I'm giving here today, it would be, Garry, that don't be that person that's trying to carry all of that. Like, and while I'm a coach and I do what I do and I want to get business, at the end of the day, I want to help people. But I get paid for it, and I get well paid for it. But if it's the case where you're struggling in any way at all, even with decisions, talk to someone about it. Yeah. And just lift that load a little bit.
But I think the difference there, Máirtín, is, you know, someone can do their textbook learning, but when you've actually gone through it and come through it,
yes,
it's a completely different experience that people get by going to you.
Oh yeah, it totally is. And I suppose it's relevant, Garry, that, you know, we're talking here in Galway, the Wednesday of the Galway races, and 3 days, 72 hours after coming out of Croke Park, and what happened there. And people say to me sometimes, in ex-county football, I know you're working as a coach, and what do you think of, you know, what happened there, and where does this leave Galway, and where does this leave the players? And it's a very relevant question.
Yeah. So just for people overseas, yes, Galway lost against Armagh by a point in the All-Ireland football final there a few days ago.
Exactly, which is the grand final, really, of football in this country. And like, when you're involved in any kind of a loss, of course it's going to hurt. and you've dedicated a lot of your life to it, and you've, prepared yourself as best possible, turned down invitations to weddings and parties, and given up the booze or cut back on it, and totally dedicated to what you're doing. And I think it was Usain Bolt that said he trains for 4 years to run for 10 seconds. And there's a good message in that. I reference in my book, have I mentioned my book 4 or 5 times?
That's okay. There's another one coming out later this year.
There's another one coming. I have a launch date actually the last weekend in November.
Brilliant.
And I have a location which I'll make public soon enough. And I'm getting through it. Yeah, I'm getting through the second book. But I mentioned in the first book, I mentioned Ronan O'Gara. And he was playing for Munster, as most people know, Munster Rugby. And he was playing the Heineken Cup final. I think this is one against one of the French clubs. I forget which one now. But he got 5 attempts at shots at goal, 5 penalties, and he missed every one of them. And Munster were beaten in that Heineken Cup by a pint. And he said he was a professional player, not like the guys on Sunday who were amateurs, who were at work. Probably today and yesterday maybe. And he talks about how much he struggled with that, and for so long. Very honest, actually. I mentioned it in the book, but he said that he went back to it and he said he learned so much from it and grew from having had the responsibility and shouldering the responsibility of, it didn't go right. And I think that's the biggest lesson we learn. Like, if I look back at my life and I look at when things went wrong, like, as I said recently, nobody makes mistake purposely. We all, to the best of our ability, try to be successful and try to make the right decisions. But sometimes because of conditions or because of circumstances, it doesn't work out. Like a lot of those chances, and it's famous now that Galway had 25 chances last Sunday and they were successful with 13. That's a very low strike rate at that level. But sometimes when I'm climbing a mountain and the wind is coming or the snow is coming and you can't see your path, it doesn't matter how well I've prepared. Something else comes into play. And that happens. But what dealing with that type of loss and that type of challenge is for a group of individuals, and like as a group in team situations, it should be easier because you have teammates, some of them who played really well, some who didn't live up to their own expectations, never mind anybody else. So there should be a gelling and a coming together there where they support each other. And I think Armagh brought that out hugely because who were their Galway's opposition on Sunday. And they've struggled with a lot of losses and near misses in the last couple of years, particularly even this year. But they stuck together, and I heard a couple of their players talking about making the guy next to you an all-star, helping him and supporting him, and that's very important. But it's the learnings from when things don't go right. Yeah, that's when you really learn. That's when you really learn and you grow, and that's where you build your resilience. Yeah, and that's the big lesson. At the end of the day, it's an amateur sport. We're all invested in it, and everybody gives out and everything else. Who probably hasn't been. Everyone
becomes an expert all of a sudden.
And people who haven't been to a match since that Aspirations in the final 2 years ago. Yeah. So there is, and that's what it became for me. It's picking out what can I influence here, what can I change, what do I need to keep doing, what other parts of my life can I make adjustments to, what's going well for me, what am I happy about. And that you move yourself away from that space of poor me, oh, look at, as I said earlier. So
I want to just briefly talk about all these mountains that you've gone and conquered. If you could kind of tell us some of the expeditions that you've gone on and why set these goals for yourself.
Okay. Well, with going back to the knee injury, that surgeon, a consultant at the time, said to me that to have any quality of life, he said, you're going to have to do one or two things if you don't let me repair your knee. And I said, what? And he said, take up swimming or cycling. And he said, whichever one you do, you're going to have to do a lot of to build up the muscles in your knee. So a couple of years later, actually, I started cycling. And I found that I could do it, and it wasn't hurting my knee in any way. In fact, it was strengthening. So I started to do a lot of it. I started to do different challenges around the country, like the Cree Cycle, the one that's famous in Galway here from the Heart Foundation. And they do a circle of the Corrib, which is about, 70 miles or something. I started doing a lot of that. And then in 1999, I heard about an organisation called the National Council for the Blind of Ireland, NCBI. And they were putting together a huge, big cycle where they were going to cycle from coast to coast in the USA. San Diego to Charleston, South Carolina, 3,000 miles in 25 days. So, of course, my ears perked up and I said, and my eyebrows and whatever else, eyelashes, I went and I found out a bit more and I said, I wonder would I be able for that. I'd got kind of into the bug of cycling and I found that it was something I could do on my own. I found that it didn't matter how the wind or the rain was on the west coast of Ireland, that I seemed to be able to handle it. And I could do it for long periods, as in a couple of hours, without really struggling too much. So I found out as much as I could, and eventually I signed up to cycle across America. Now they brought us to Dublin and they designed training programs for us and they tested us and they did everything. But long story short, I actually was successful and I did cycle across America, coast to coast, with the team. 32 of us left Ireland.
Wow.
And I think the number was 13 of us cycled every mile without missing a mile. Some people had saddle sores, tummy upsets, different injuries, mental breakdowns, all kinds of things, because we cycled every day. We averaged 137 miles a day for 25 days. But even that alone, I found that my mindset was really strong. I struggled, of course, on certain days. I wasn't a born cyclist. I was a GAA player. But my body changed so much while I was preparing for it. I lost a lot of weight. I was putting out different power. I had to manage myself on long climbs and hills because I'm heavy boned. But I learned how to draft. I learned how to ride my bike in different circumstances, and I became really good at it. And that was a huge success. And that kind of brought me on. Then the National Council for the Blind, they organised a lot of cycling events. Then they figured out that they had two types of person that they were catering for: someone who wanted to raise funds and just go to some location and do 6 days of cycling out of that location and still raise funds. Then they had the likes of myself, more hardcore, I suppose, people who wanted to do more challenging cycles, but would still raise funds for the organisation. So for many years they brought us to France and we used to do 7 or 8 of the hardest stages of the Tour de France that particular year. So I did a lot of that. Brilliant. Did an awful lot of cycling. But when I moved to Connemara then 9 years ago, as I mentioned earlier, we were right in the burn. I look out the window and I see the sea and I see the burn. So I started doing a bit of hiking, just for a change. I was kind of tired, I suppose, of the long endurance cycling and that. I wasn't getting the same buzz out of it anymore. So I started hiking. And then in 2018, I mentioned to my son Sean, he was down one night in Connemara with us, and as we do, like we usually come back from a night out and we go drinking whiskey and make big plans for the following few months. So on one of those nights I told him, I said, I'm going to go to Everest Base Camp. I said, would you have any interest? And he said, God, I'd love that. So we trained together at different times, and even though I do an awful lot more training than he does, he's one of these natural kind of wrap up and I can do it. He looks at me like, suppose you're training hard, Dad. Yeah, but he joined me and we went to Everest Base Camp. Since then I've been to Kilimanjaro.
Brilliant.
Sean didn't come with me on that one, but I did another one then in Argentina. There's the highest mountains on the 7 continents. They're called the 7 summits. But the highest mountain in the world outside of the Himalayas is in Argentina. And it's one called Aconcagua. It's the second highest. The success rate on it is only 32%. Wow. So we went to do that one with a gentleman from Connemara, a Gaelic like ourselves, Michael Kane. And Michael had tried to summit Aconcagua 15 years previously, and he wasn't successful. So we went out to do a bit of training with him because he's a good man in the mountains, Michael, huge amount of experience. And the more we were talking about Aconcagua, he called me and he said, I think I'm going to go with you. So he joined us. So luckily enough, we summited. We were successful.
Super.
And it was great, actually. We spoke Gaelic at the top of Aconcagua, and it was lovely. But like, it's brought... Why the challenge? I'm always interested in challenging myself and seeing, how far I can push myself. I have a good mindset about setting a goal and the preparation. But for me, it's not all about getting to the top of the mountain. For me, it's having a bit of discipline in my life, the frequency of training, watching my nutrition, whatever, without being a pain in the where I can manage it. And if you invite me for a night out, Gary, that I won't turn you down.
Yeah.
But that I'll know 2 days later I'm going to be out doing a bit of exercise and training. I know it's good for my health, but I find it's really good for my head.
Yeah, because even I was doing a bit of training for, it's a completely different, climb, but Croagh Patrick from Galway Hospice. But like I was really good in those 6 weeks leading up to it, training and being on the stepper in the gym and so on. So I wasn't panting away going up there. But after it, then it's like, okay, I need something else now. Otherwise the train is just going to flatline on me, you know.
Well, like I had a conversation with Pat Falvey in Kerry a couple of years ago, and Pat's famous for having summited Everest twice, and he's done the 7 summits twice as well. But everyone was gone to bed anyway. There was a group of us down to do a bit of hiking with him and some mountaineering, climbing and with ropes and that, some training. But Pat and myself stayed up drinking a drop of whiskey anyway, and he just said to me, he said, we were talking about the mental strength of some of these endurance, and he just looked at me at some stage and he just said, have you been there? I said, I have, yeah. I knew exactly what he meant. And for somebody listening who might never have been to that place, and I'm going to explain where it is in a minute, it's when you're pushing for a really, really difficult goal, and in this case it was climbing a high mountain. I was referencing, I suppose, cycling across America as well, but it's the space where you feel just knackered and you feel like you cannot go on. And it's very hard to describe to someone who'd never put themselves in that situation, but for people who do, you find a strength within yourself, but it's deep in there someplace, that when the chips are really down and everything is saying that you spend too long on your feet, you burn too much energy, you're carrying too much weight, the wind is too strong, whatever, the conditions are totally against you, it's where you find that strength to push through. I've been there a few times, he's been there as well, and we spoke about it and finding that, but the strength you get from knowing that, Gary. And I think, with reference to what you said to me about the 3 nights that I didn't, I think it's part of that deep within me, there's something that I can actually call on to push. Now, the time will come I'll call on it, I won't have it, but I still have that.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to explain, but I actually think my son has it as well, because I see him in the high mountains and he does not struggle, and he's very helpful to people with him. Sometimes he can be stronger than some of the guides, and like we talk about it at times. I don't know, he said, I probably have the same thing you have, and we laugh it off, like, but it's a strength, it's a mental strength, of course, but there's a physical element to it, but there's, I think, a deep energy within that when you need it, hopefully a few of the Galway footballers have it, that'll bring them back again.
Yeah.
And I talk in more depth about it at times, but like, it is something that you everybody, I think, has it, but nobody allows themselves to go that deep. To find
accept the discomfort and pain.
True. But like, what the other thing that Pat said to me that night, Pat Falvey, and you reminded me of it there now, that during those 6 weeks when you were preparing for Croagh Patrick and that, like, Pat said to me, what keeps you going? And I said, no, I'm asking you. I said, what keeps you going? Because we were kind of, and he just said, well, he said, for me, he said, it's to have the next one planned. And that's very important. I think when you come, I'm only back from Machu Picchu, which I did with my wife, Dolores, this time. She wanted to do it. I said I'd do it with her. And like, to see her preparing for it and to see the changes she made. And I go to a gym in Oranmore and she goes to a gym in Gart. I'd come back from the gym at 7:30 a.m. She'd be gone. And then she'd come home sometimes and she'd go for a walk in the burn. She was really dedicated to, and she did really well. But everyone has this power within them that if you set a goal for yourself, that God, what do I need to do now to make sure that happens? I need to do this. I need to do this. I need to watch my diet. I need to train meticulously as often as I can. You'd be amazed what you can do. But having something else planned after completing that one, even if it's a year away, it doesn't matter. That's a real focus for you to say to yourself, right, okay, I need that. I need to be preparing for that. Everybody's different. Yeah. Some other people listen to this will say, no, going fishing is enough for me.
Fair enough, yeah.
Fair enough, yeah.
It's great that you mentioned Dolores as well, because like we've had hours and hours of conversations off the mic throughout this year. And sometimes when you're talking about your life, you mention BD and AD.
I do, yeah.
BD being before Dolores and AD after Dolores, or present day.
Yeah, and she'll kill you for bringing this up, and I'll blame her. I'll say, I blame you. I'll say I didn't bring it up. I'll bring you up. Garry did. Yeah, I was lucky enough, I suppose, in the depths of whatever I was, that I had worked on there was a cycle race that went around Ireland famously it was an 8-day international cycle race called the Ross.
Oh yeah.
And a lot of international riders come to it and have done over the years. But for many years, I used to work on that race I used to work as a driver, bring around in cycling. There's a referee. He's called the commissar. It's a French word. And they keep an eye on things that are being done right. Riders are being fed in the right time, drinks coming up at the right time, punctures are being repaired, whatever else. They control the race. And I used to drive in the middle of all the cyclists, and it was real high octane stuff, but I was good at it. But I'd stepped away from it for 2 years during the worst of my problems and issues. And they came and they asked me, would I come back, that they were really struggling to get some of my experience. So I reluctantly went back and did the race that year for them. But the first 3 nights, and it's famous for lads well able who are not racing, well able to drink pints and talking about old races, you can imagine. Yeah. But anyway, I hadn't gone out for the previous 3 nights because I just didn't want to be facing people. I was still not in a great place. But the 4th night anyway, and it's an 8-day race, I think we were up in Donegal. The guys said to me, you're coming out with us tonight. So I reluctantly gave in. They were nice fellas and they just wanted to be. So I went out. But lo and behold, I met Dolores that night. She was working with a Dublin team and on the same race. And she just came over to me one night and she said, obviously, the lads who knew me well and the women involved in the race had been talking about me and what I was going through. And she came over to me and she just said, I heard you're going through a tough time. And I said, yeah. I said, look at blah, blah, blah. But she had her own troubles and she was divorced. And she said, sure, when you're in Dublin sometime, she said, give me a shout. So I didn't even ask her for her number. So I don't know, a couple of, maybe 6 or 7 months later, my son Sean he had a girlfriend in Dublin at the time, and it was her 21st. And she invited me up. So I went up and I went to the pub they were in that night, and I left kind of early, but the following day I just said, I wonder, would I meet Dolores? And I said, I haven't got her number. But there was a lady who runs a lot of races. She runs a junior tour and she works on the Ross as well. I rang her and I said, would you have Dolores' number? And she said, I do. So she sent it to me. And we met for a coffee that day, and kind of the rest is kind of history. But I think something put Dolores in my way because she's a nurse, retired nurse now, but at the time she was nursing. And I don't know, when Dolores met me, like, relationships are lovely and it's romance and it's love and usually everybody's going in the same direction. But when Dolores met me, wherever she was, I was going the opposite direction anyway. I was in the throes of where I was. I didn't think too highly of myself. I was struggling in every part of my life. But she kept in contact with me, and slowly it became a relationship. And I used to go to Dublin and come back down to try to sort out the affairs of the nation, and go back up weekends or whatever. And eventually, after a couple of years, she said to me, you need to move from where you are. She said, I see you. She said, you come up on a Friday. She said, and your energy raises. But on Sunday, even before you leave, she said, Sunday morning, you've been to drop again. And she said, what are you going down for anyway? And I began to think about it, and she was right. So eventually I moved to Dublin. And that was the best move I ever made, because I got out of that place where everybody knew me. Yeah. And it gave me breathing space again. And I started, the only work I probably was really proficient at was anything to do with transport. So I started to do a little bit of consultation work for an organisation in Dublin, where I used to go into transport companies and help them out. And that, I began to draw my breath up there. And I could walk down to the local pub and Dolores would go with me. They knew us as, she was from Kerry, I was from Galway. I think he's an ex-county footballer, full stop. They didn't know anything else. And that gave me breathing space.
Anonymity.
And it was like, and I go around out of the estate we were living in, and I go into the little spar shop on the corner, and there was a lot of Polish women working in there. I knew all their names, I knew their family, it was lovely because nobody knew anything about me. But then every so often I'd have to come down for whatever. Sometimes it was court cases, other times it was meetings, all that, and trying to still keep some semblance of directorship on what I had left behind me. But the fact that I knew I was coming away from it again, it eased the pressure a little bit. So that's where Dolores came in, and she really helped me at a time where I wasn't being helped by anybody else. And whatever she saw in me, as I said, I was going the wrong way.
Yeah.
She saw kindness. I think she probably saw something that she felt strongly about. I don't know. After today, I'll have to ask her, Garry, actually.
Yeah, there's a lovely energy from her.
Yeah, and I think I found that. And like, she tells me that I brought a great energy to her as well, and that, I was appreciative. I was a different kind of a person. And it worked anyway. And we got married just last November, gone by for the second time. So it's second marriage for me, second marriage for her as well. Ironically, we both have 2 kids around the same age. Dolores' son Andrew, and Emily, her daughter, and my son Sean, and Rena, my daughter. And we both have grandchildren now. So it's I'm struggling to see mine, but she sees hers quite often. And it's funny, like in the beginning, it's amazing, like when Dolores was having any association with her grandchildren, I used to run a mile from it because it was reminding me what I didn't have.
Yeah.
And that was difficult because she wanted more of the grandchildren and I wanted less of them.
Yeah.
But we had a conversation about it, as we do about a lot of things. And she said to me, but Máirtín, she said, Andrew's kids love you. And she said, you need to look at it differently. And it was amazing. It was like just a wake-up call. Like, they love me as if I was their granddad. Like. So I changed my mindset about that. And I suppose there's another message there that sometimes we go into places about situations that we shouldn't. And we put ourselves in situations because we think, oh God, I don't want to feel that now because I can't have it with my own. Whereas these kids love me. Like when I go back to when I was living with my sister, Fionnuala, back in Injavon, like the best thing about that move for me was she had 3 kids and they loved me.
Yeah.
At the time, worst time ever in my life. They thought I was God.
Yeah, they didn't judge.
They didn't judge. And they used to come in and sit in the chairs beside me and they'd talk about their problems and and to this day, I'm so close to them. They were, I think, another draw for me not to jump into the sea those mornings. Because every time I'd go in there, one of them would come out and they'd sit down and all of a sudden my troubles were so far away because Niamh was talking about somebody in the classroom and Owen was talking about wanting to have muscles like me. And the older one, Alva, she'd kill me if she hears this, she was talking about things and I'd ask her, had she any boyfriends, and she'd get all shy and everything. But it was normal stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And that meant so much to me that time. When I felt like nobody loved me, these kids loved me. And I got a strength from that, like, and it's hard to explain, but, and I'm getting it now from Dolores' grandchildren as well, that they, like, I speak Irish to them, and the eldest one is going to a Gaelic school, and she loved to see me coming. So, it's, I had to change my mindset about it. I was running away from it, like the films on the television I mentioned earlier, or the sad songs on the radio, or, like we all go into these self-protect things. And I said, well, Máirtín, hold on, you're preaching about this all the time. You need to practice what you preach. Turn around here. There's a lot of love here to be got. Yeah. These people are not judging you. These people, they know you as Dolores' husband. So, yeah, sure, I'm learning every day.
Look, there's so much more wisdom there as well. But I did say to the podcast, it was about an hour's recording. We're over an hour over this stage, so we better wrap it up. Mind Over Mountains is Máirtín's book, and it's also his website. And Máirtín, you have a podcast coming out as well.
So I believe, with recording with GK Media there, you probably know them.
Oh, they're great guys there, and ladies. So that's super exciting as well. So your first series that you've done so far is they're like mini masterclasses, you know, and there's a different theme in each episode.
That's
and it's what I love about them is it's one of those things you can just go for a walk, you know, just give yourself some quiet space and just hear the stories and the nuggets of wisdom and the advice and the takeaways that you can get from the stories that you share in each episode.
Yeah, that's well put, actually. Yeah, and I think they're fairly shortish. They're around the half hour, and some of them are less.
Yeah,
but there'd be something that you might listen to going for a walk, as you said, driving the car or whatever. But a lot of them are based on my own experience and what I'm finding dealing with clients all the time, and what I see works for people and worked for myself. So the second series, which I probably will do next month now, I will interview some people, some interesting people from a mindset perspective, from dealing with adversity, you know, building resilience, all that. Because I think, like I find with leaders and business owners especially, like while they come to me for one or two parts of their life that they feel that they're struggling with, there's always hidden stuff that needs to be found and needs to be dealt with for the overall picture. Like, people talk about balance and work-life balance, and I talk about it a lot myself, but I think it's more harmony that we have to find with all parts of our life, where of course there's parts of it that you'd rather would be better, but you're just leaving it there. But the overall picture then is you're disjointed, like. I know from where I came from myself. So it's about working with people to try and get that harmony, where sometimes you do have to give more attention to your work or your job or career, but other times you can actually level it out and spend a bit more time with your kids or with your partner or whatever. But to realize that and to talk about it and say, look, for the next couple of months, I'm going to have to do it. We need to make a bit of money. I need to improve this, whatever it is. And I think harmony is probably a better word for it. But not to forget in that harmony, and I talk about it in one of the podcasts, that your own health is your wealth, of course, but it's our biggest asset. And we need to mind that as well. And that's very important.
Yeah, and I think anyone in business, we've all gone through that experience of it kind of being a bit of a lonely journey. So it's great when you can actually talk to someone who has had experience of being in business through the highs and the lows, and the reinvention as well. You can just have that open, transparent, non-judgmental conversation with it. It really makes a huge difference.
Yeah, 100%.
So you're an author, you're a podcaster, you're a business coach, you have your website, Mind Over Mountains, as well. You do talks and you do one-on-one consultations with people, and you're constantly climbing mountains and stuff.
Right, yeah. Right, okay, yeah.
So plenty of positives there now.
Plenty of positives.
To throw into the jigsaw.
I'm enjoying this part of my life, really, Gary. I love helping people. I get messages from people after working with them, and they'd blow your mind. Like, it's not €1 million, but it's worth millions of euros when you see light bulbs coming on for people, and you kind of say, yes.
Yeah. And you mentioned your newsletter that comes out on LinkedIn every Thursday, so people can find you on LinkedIn and subscribe to the newsletter.
And there's Máirtín Óg,
Yeah, and like there was one there a couple of weeks ago, which was the one about getting that phone call from the bank before going into that meeting with the board, and I was just saying, wow, it's just so powerful. Like, it just sucked me right in straight away. Yeah. So even to get those little things in your inbox every Thursday, you know, I'd recommend people sign up for it. Yeah,
it makes a difference, and if people want to find me, as you said, LinkedIn, I probably do a lot. I'm on all over social media, but on Facebook, on Instagram, but particularly LinkedIn. I get a bit of business out of that. If anybody wants me to come in and do a talk, I guarantee you no one will fall asleep in the talk. But I find that given that base to people, where I could talk all day about cycling across America or climbing one of these big mountains in Argentina or the Himalayas or whatever, but like, while some people will relate a little bit to that, and I feel that I've much more to offer, that I can talk about pain points that I've gone through, struggled with, that people around the table or in a crowded hall are struggling with the same things. And when I see the last talk I did recently, you were involved in it yourself doing the sound, where I could see people crying in the room. But the big thing that I noticed, and I scanned the room all the time, nobody was on their phones. Everybody was switched on to what was being said and what was going on. And that's the best compliment you can get as a speaker at these events.
Absolutely. Continued success, Máirtín.
Turmoil with